Alrighty, welcome to week 2 of the Quilt Code Along. I think I got my sound fixed. Again, so sorry about that. Sound quality last week was pretty poor. It should all be fixed. Are we good? Alrighty, let's get started. Just a little recap of the ground rules. These sessions are being recorded. Only the audio and the slides are getting recorded. Your video is not going to be on screen, so don't worry about that. Please stay muted until the Q&A portion, just so that we don't get too many background noises on the recording. You have a raise hand button at the bottom of your screen if this is your first time in Google Meet. Please use that to ask a question. That's going to start a queue, and then I can just run through in order later on. We also have our Quilt Code Along Hub page. If you haven't checked that out, please do. It looks a little bit different now because we're in week 2, but this is where the recordings are going to be posted. That's also where you can access the share gallery and upload your progress pics if you don't want to post on Instagram. Alrighty, I'm going to go ahead and turn my video off as we dive into this week's content. So this week, we are basically focusing on piecing the quilt part of your quilt coat. There's a couple of notions, though, that are going to be important later on as we make the quilt coat. And so I just these next couple of weeks are going to be a little bit of prep work for what comes later as we just kind of piece the quilt part of our quilt coat, which I'm sure you guys are all familiar with and don't need any help with because we're all quilters. That's the easy part. It's the part that comes after that scares a little bit of people. So these couple of weeks are going to be covering some prep work for that. So there's some critical notions and then there's some nice to have notions that I'm going to talk about this week. And this was the topic of the blog post. So all of that information is repeated there, as well as links to all of these tools if you want to grab any of them. The first thing that is super, super critical is a flexible tape measure, also known as a tailor's ruler. Basically, it's just a piece of vinyl tape measure that you can use to measure your body and figure out which size of quilt coat that you need to make. If you don't want to buy one of these, you can use just a piece of non-stretchable fabric to measure your body and then compare that to your quilting ruler to get a dimension. But these things are cheap. You may already have one if you got a hand-me-on sewing box from a grandparent or an aunt or something like that. Grab one of them. They're really helpful to have, and it'll help you make sure that you can get a garment that is perfectly fit to your body instead of the other way around, which is really, really important. The next one that's really important is some sort of pattern weight. That's these black things in this image. These are official pattern weights. You can buy them. They're a couple bucks on Amazon. Basically, they're just heavy little sandbags that you can scatter across your paper pattern, and it holds it nice and stable to the fabric while you cut things out, rather than having to fish pins through, which is the traditional way of getting your garment pieces cut. You don't have to buy the official pattern weights. There are many, many things that you can use as pattern weights instead, but you're going to want something to hold that pattern down because pinning really isn't ideal. It distorts your fabric and can make it so that your garment pieces aren't really the correct shape and size, which just leads to issues later on. So these are official pattern weights. You can buy those, or you can use, if you kind of flip back in my Instagram, you'll see I tend to use big cones of thread a lot. Those are pretty good pattern weights, but they are a little bit bulky, which makes it difficult to get in there with a rotary cutter. Another great thing, and you'll see this if you look on Cotton Bourbon's, I think it's Cotton Bourbon's Instagram page. She uses 2 or 3 inch washers, just cheap washers from the hardware store, and those work pretty good. They just have some heft to them, and you can scatter them across your pattern piece to hold that thing flat. The third really critical one, and there's not really a good replacement for this, is a 28 millimeter rotary cutter. So that's your 45 mil rotary cutter that's typical for quilting. 28 mils are about half that size, a little over half that size. What they do is allow you to get in around that curves and have really nice control over that rotary cutter so that you can feel comfortable putting your hand next to it and cutting without a ruler. This is going to feel really awful to you as a quilter the first time you do it. I avoided it for months when I first started garment quilting and insisted on cutting with shears, which is a nightmare. And then I tried it and realized that I had made it out to be way worse than it is. The 28 mils give you really, really, really good control over that rotary cutter. And I'm perfectly comfortable now. The first time I tried it, it was like, oh, this is easy to just place my hand on the pattern and kind of cut along next to the paper with my 28 mil without a guard. It's not a big deal. If you're nervous about this, what I would say is don't put your hand there the first time. Just cut with your rotary cutter along that pattern until you get a feel for how easy it is. I think it'll come pretty naturally, and then you can move your hand in. If you're really, really worried about it, don't want to cut your fingers, you can get a little cut-proof glove from the hardware store to just put on that hand as you cut, but I think you're going to find pretty quickly that this is nowhere near as hard as it looks. So those are the critical ones. Some other notions that you might find helpful, again, these are nice to haves, but can be helpful. The first one is this like super crazy looking object. It's called a tailor's ham. Again, the name is very weird. Basically, it's just a three-dimensional pressing object. The nice thing about it, it'll have like a fat end and a tapered end. The tapered end is something that you can stick up inside your garment and kind of in a sleeve seam in order to be able to press those seams flat. Again, nice to have, not critical. Usually with adult size garments, you can maneuver that thing around to get the part that you're pressing flat enough to press with kind of the tip of your iron, especially if you've got like a mini iron. But they can be helpful if you're really wanting to get your sleeves or your seams nice and flat in like sleeves and curved seams that you can't really get down on an ironing mat. Another one that's really helpful is a stiletto. That's this thing coming in. It's basically just a like metal pointy object with a handle on it. The critical thing here for me is that you make sure you get a metal one. The plastic ones do not work nearly as well because they bend. I use these a lot for piecing. It's a critical notion for me for piecing in order to get really precise seams, but it's also really helpful for garment seams because you're going to have curved seams that don't necessarily want to stay together. And what that stiletto allows you to do is just keep pressure on that seam, keep it together even after you've had to remove your pins and whatnot already as you get it all the way underneath the needle without harming your fingers. They're super cheap. Grab one. You'll find it really, really helpful for piecing as well, but it's important for garment sewing as well. Final one, which I think probably most of you already have already, is Wonder Clips. So those are basically just substitutes for pins. Again, really important for a quilt coat because we're going to be sewing basically two quilted pieces together and there's going to be a lot of bulk there. Pins don't really work for that. You're going to have a hard time kind of getting a pin in that much fabric. And so being able to clip and just hold it together that way is really, really simple. So pull out your Wonder Clips if you don't tend to use them too much for quilting normally. Alrighty. The other task for this week is to get your pattern printed. There's a bunch of ways you can do that. Most patterns are going to come with multiple kind of template files. One of them will always be just kind of standard printer paper. You're going to print anywhere from like 12 to 48 sheets of paper, cut down one side, tape them together, do all of that overlap stuff. It's kind of a pain. They will also usually come with what's called a projector file. If you have a sewing projector that kind of projects the image from the ceiling that you can cut along, great. Most people don't have that unless you're a super dedicated garment sewer already. I don't have one. I don't particularly like them. The third file, though, is going to be labeled A0 print file. And what that basically is just large format printing. An A0 file is going to be 3 foot by 4 foot, so basically poster size. And it allows you to essentially fit all of your template pieces on one sheet of paper so you don't have any paper seams, you don't have to tape stuff together, you don't have to line stuff up. It just makes life really easy. Most garment patterns are going to come with that file option. If you are working with a garment pattern from someone who doesn't normally make garment patterns, there's a chance you might not have it, but the vast majority of them will have this A0 file. I'm told a lot of print shops will be able to print this for you. So think like, an independent like promo printer, Kinko's, that kind of a store. I say most people will tell you that because I have yet to find a single one that can actually print A0. Kinko's won't do it. I think you need to find like a kind of an independent printer that would be able to print this for you. But what I do instead is just find a garment fabric shop. The Fabric Snob is actually our sponsor for this week. That's where I get my patterns printed. She has a big, large format printer and you just upload your files and she'll print them for you and mail them to you. It's great. That's part of why I asked her to be a sponsor for this week because I love that service. That's where every time I get a new garment pattern, I just send the file to her and she prints it out for me. They're usually like $4 or $5 page. It's super cost effective and it saves you a big pain of trying to print like 25 pieces of paper and tape them together, which would be the alternative. So I highly, highly encourage that you go get your file printed from the Fabric Snob. She knows you're coming. She's going to get your patterns turned around and mailed back to you super quickly. She is a shop in Alberta, Canada. For the US folks, it's not a big deal. She's happy to ship internationally, and the shipping's actually super reasonable. And with the exchange rate, it actually works in our favor anyways. With the A0 printing, you also have the option of using PDF layers to reduce the number of sizes shown, so you don't have as many lines to try and figure out which size you're supposed to cut. Here's what that looks like. So basically, if you open that A0 print file in like an Adobe Acrobat free version, you can open the layers panel. It's usually a little tab all over on the far right. When you open that tab, you're going to see something like this. So you've got each of your sizes, and what you're going to do is just toggle the ones that you don't need off by just clicking like the little eyeball icon. So that takes it from a pattern that maybe has 25 sizes down to just a handful of them. We're going to talk a little later in the sew along about how to determine which size of garment you need to make for your body. We'll talk about how to take your measurements and choose that size and all that good stuff. But either way, I do not recommend printing just one size. Nobody is one straight size, or almost nobody, very few of us anyways. And so what you can do is just kind of take a guess at which size you might be. If you're normally a large, pick a large, and then have 2 to 3 sizes on either side of that size printed, and that'll give you enough to work with without having just this overwhelming amount of lines on your pattern. Okay? Super easy. Once you kind of toggle off the ones you don't need, you just save that file, and then that's what you're going to upload to the printer, and they'll have printed for you. They'll print only the ones that you had highlighted. If you're a quilter, you buy a lot of digital patterns, this might feel a little bit like a copyright violation. It's not, because they're printing it for you. They're not taking a copy of the pattern and duplicating it and distributing it. In fact, most garment patterns will actually come with a little copyright statement for the print shop that says, hey, I released this to be printed at a print shop for personal use, all of that good stuff. It is kosher. You're okay. Alrighty, that's all I have got for this week. I'm going to go ahead and turn my video back on here. Do we have any questions for this week? Let me check the chat. Okay, looks like we've got one question from Mandy. She says, can you talk a little bit about the advantages of rolled A0 paper patterns versus folded ones? So for those of you that aren't aware, when you get a pattern printed, a lot of times they'll offer you the option of having them rolled. So you'll get like basically a 3-foot rolled poster tube, or having them pre-folded. It's really just a matter of preference. The rolled ones are usually considered like premium because you don't have creases in your paper. I personally prefer the folded ones better because rolled ones are always going to want to curve one direction. And so if that happens to be away from your fabric, it can be really hard to get them held down against your fabric to cut properly. The creased ones also make it really easy to just fold them back up and stick in like a big manila envelope when you're done with the pattern, so that it's all nice and organized, and you can come back to that later if you want to make the pattern again. But again, really just a matter of preference. The rolled ones also are a little bit difficult to store because you end up with these big long paper tubes that you need to get like a big box for. The folded ones end up just being like a regular printer size sheet of paper once they fold up. But again, it's totally a matter of preference. Get whichever one printed that you feel more comfortable with. Alrighty. Doesn't look like I've got any more questions. So I'm going to wrap things up here. Alrighty, so reminders for this week, your to-dos are to pre-wash for fabrics like we talked about last week. If you haven't done that already, make sure you do that before you cut into them. Cut your quilt pieces. So get all of your piecing pieces cut according to your quilt pattern. If you're using a quilt pattern, get all of those prepped and ready to go. If you want, you can start piecing them. Next week is going to be focused on just getting that quilt part, the quilt back, quilt top, whatever you want to call it, all pieced and ready to go. So that we can turn it into the quilted part of your quilt coat. And then get your quilt coat pattern printed. Again, I highly, highly recommend the Fabric Snob. I'm going to drop a link to that in the recording description so you can find her website. It is super easy to just upload a pattern. She knows you're coming. She's going to get them turned around really quick for you guys and get them sent back so we have them in time to make our quilt coat. Along with that, she is the sponsor for this week because her shop is amazing. I highly recommend it, and I really wanted to share it with you guys. So post a progress pic by Wednesday, April 3rd, by 8 p.m. Eastern, so that I can draw a winner and get it sent out in the Thursday morning email. The prize for this week is going to be free A0 printing. So go ahead and check out her shop, even if you don't win, because she's got some really amazing things. I think today she's running a sale on what they call fluff. Fluff is the most amazing sweatshirt fleece. So if you've ever wanted to make a hoodie, maybe grab some of that. And once you get a first garment under your belt, you'll find how easy it is to make stuff. I've made like 2 or 3 sweatshirts out of this stuff. It is phenomenal. I'm probably going to do some shopping later today, but she's got every kind of fabric you could think of, including some stuff that you may want to consider using for the lining of your quilt coat, which we'll talk about next week. All kinds of knits, every color you can imagine, really high quality fabric for a reasonable price. Highly, highly recommend her shop. But definitely go get your pattern printed at least this week, because it's going to save you a lot of pain later to get your pattern pieces for your quilt coat. Alrighty, that's all I got. Until next week, happy sewing. See ya.